Great Partition, presented by Amity University. Please welcome Vazira Zamindar to take over.
Thank you. Welcome to this panel on the partition of 1947, an event of such enormity that it lies at the heart of the 20th century, not just in terms of chronology, but also for the kinds of questions it has raised about 20th century nationalism, minority rights, genocidal violence, and mass displacement. It's viewed by some as an expedient political solution, and by others as representing the deep, dark side of modernity itself. As I wrote in my own book, The Long Partition, this is an event that is not yet past. It continues to be played out as a moral tale for critiquing the present, for mobilizing a politics of exclusion, and for directing violence against minorities, for explaining interstate conflicts of our present. I'm Vazira Zamindar, an historian at Brown University, and it is my great honor to be in conversation on this panel with at least two writers here who have deeply influenced my scholarship and the more recent scholarship that has given me great pause. Ayesha Jalal here is one of the most important and prolific historians of modern South Asia, perhaps someone who needs no introduction. Her seminal text from the 1980s, The Sole Spokesman, challenged histories that were driven by the teleology of partition by arguing that partition was only one of the many possible outcomes that were being negotiated for in the fight up to independence, thus opening up for examination contingency, the contingency of the political outcome and what would ensue thereafter. A large number of historians since then have been working on thinking about trying to account for the contingency of partition and what unfolded thereafter. Many monographs, textbooks, and essays. The most recent work, of course, is The Pity of Partition, and she was in conversation about that book yesterday. The other panelist, Urvashi Butalia's book, The Other Side of Silence, was part of a groundbreaking feminist intervention that shifted our attention from all of these histories that were trying to answer why partition had happened to finally paying attention to the catastrophic what had happened. She has now edited a new volume called The Long Shadow of Partition, and that is her most recent contribution. Venkat Dhulipala here is a young historian at the University of North Carolina, and his recent book, Creating a New Medina, arguably challenges the opening that Ayesha's 30-year-old book set in motion, and it's a book that's been making waves across the Indian media. Nisid Hajari is a former editor of Newsweek and now with the Bloomberg Review, whose utterly riveting Midnight Furies narrates partition to an international audience. Yasmin Khan, it was not sure if Yasmin was going to actually make it today, which is why I am actually moderating this session as opposed to what it says on the program. Yasmin Khan wrote The Great Partition, The Making of India and Pakistan, another very important seminal text in narrating partition and the contingency and what unfolds after 1947. This is, I think this panel represents some of the most important writing on this historical event. So it's particularly an important conversation for us to be having today. Now I'm going to ask each one of the panelists a separate question, although any of them can jump in and engage with those questions. And the reason for that is just to move beyond the sort of the generalized narratives of partition and to begin to think more specifically about issues that need to be addressed. That is, we've had several decades of scholarship. Where should we be going now? What questions remain unanswered? What questions do we need to be asking? And after that, I'm going to open up for perhaps the audience if they have questions that they would like to ask. So I'm going to begin by asking Ayesha the first question. And I'm going to ask you a question really from political history rather than your most recent book, Pity of Partition, which examined Manto's writing and what they contribute to understanding of partition. And I want to bring us back to the Pakistan resolution of 23rd March 1940. It's almost 75 years since that resolution was passed. And one of the really important significances of the Pakistan resolution was that in 1940, the Muslim League made a claim that Muslims were no longer to be considered a minority, but were rather a nation. Now, in that resolution, there were two parts. One that demanded independent states, but the other, equally important, given the majority of Muslims were minorities in most of the subcontinent, the second part was safeguards for minorities. Strong minority safeguards was something that somehow seems to have fallen off the radar in terms of the political negotiations leading up to partition. And I want us to think about Pakistan and partition as a history that's deeply intertwined with the history of minority rights, partly given this present moment where there's an intensification of violence against minorities in both India and Pakistan. How might this question have renewed importance for thinking about histories of partition? Ayesha.
Well, thank you, Zamindar. Vazira. Let me say that you've mentioned the Lahore Resolution. I mean, in a sense, the Muslim League's movement was an attempt to settle the question of minority rights. The question is how it intended to do that. You mentioned the Lahore Resolution, but the fourth paragraph of the Lahore Resolution spoke of the Constitution in the singular, which meant that there was, at least, Jinnah left it an open question, how minority rights in Hindustan and Pakistan would be sort of reciprocal. Now, the fact that two nations emerged, and since then three have emerged, has really complicated the minority rights question. So I would say that partition, if anything, far from solving the problem of minority rights, aggravated it. And one of the reasons that we cannot find a solution without sort of going through movements of persecution, discrimination, if not outright genocide against minorities, is precisely the legacy of partition. So I think those things need to be disentangled. The fact that this was initially a minority rights movement, but when the creation of of two nation states rather than one that could have sorted out a power sharing arrangement, as I argued in my work, and that has morphed into now three nation states with each facing minority rights issues, whether it's Pakistan, whether it's India, or whether it's even to some extent Bangladesh.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the next question of Nisid, and anyone, please, if you want to jump into the answering these questions, please do feel free to do so. Nisid Hajari, Foucault in Madness and Civilization begins with this quote from Pascal. Men are so necessarily mad that not to be mad would amount to another form of madness. And he does so to make this argument that madness and non-madness, reason and non-reason, are inextricably involved. They're inseparable. Yet madness remains the most important trope for explaining the genocidal violence of partition, particularly in the Punjab. You will hear again and again this remark, it was all madness. This madness is arguably very powerfully captured in the story of Toba Tek Singh. It's a narrative trope that, Nisid, you use in your chapter titles. And yet your own account and that of many other historians since my work, Yasmin, Stephen Wilkinson's, Ashish Nandi's, a large number of work now suggests that this violence needs to be explained or can be explained and can be understood as unnervingly, unsettlingly organized. Now, if one takes that seriously, this emerging scholarship, new ways of thinking about partition violence, how might we place partition in a 20th century of genocidal violence? How might we compare it to Rwanda, Bosnia, and of course, preceding partition, the Holocaust?
Yeah, no, thank you, Vazira. Can you hear me? There are a lot of similarities between these. The trope of madness is the easiest one to seize upon. It's understandable why you would do it. You look at these episodes of mass violence, nothing seems to be able to explain it. How does an ordinary villager pick up a scythe or a sword and go next door to his neighbor who he's lived with for decades and kill him and kill his whole family? How can that be explained? There are two ways. One is that this person was misguided, that some sort of political demagogue had driven them to this. And the other is this trope of madness, that some sort of madness swept across an immense population all at the same time, and that they can't explain their own actions, their leaders can't explain them either, and therefore nobody has to take responsibility for it. But in partition, in 1947, just as you saw in the Rwanda massacres much later, this scale of mass ethnic cleansing was not spontaneous. People, if it were just farmers killing their neighbors, it is something that probably would have been able to be brought under control fairly quickly. But the scale of the violence, the scale of the killings were so large because you had small, you can call them militias, you can call them death squads, you can call them war bands as they were called at the time, small hardcore groups of armed, oftentimes trained, because this is just post-World War II, killers who would go around and whip up passions among ordinary villagers, build a mob from 50 to 500 to 5,000 people, and then a mob mentality takes over. And then, of course, the killing becomes a little more explainable, just as you saw in Rwanda as well. But that sort of seed of violence that comes from organization is critical to setting off the wider waves of killings, I think.
Can I just chip in there, and I suppose linked to both those questions, the question that you put to Ayesha and also to Nisid is often the demand for Pakistan is conflated with the violence, and I think this is something that we kind of have to separate out, that demanding Pakistan or demanding minority rights wasn't the same necessarily as demanding a violent solution to the subcontinent, and unfortunately those two kind of ways of understanding 1947 in the aftermath of what happened and what we see happened kind of get put on the same track and somehow run simultaneously. Whereas, of course, there was this terrible violence which was mounting in the preceding months. And I think, kind of disentangling those two things is very, very difficult, but actually incredibly important.
If I may jump in.
Yeah.
I think looking at the question of violence, I think it cannot be...
Don't hold it, otherwise
Okay, yeah. Can you hear me better now? Okay. I think if you are to look at this whole issue of violence, I think you need to really take into account the discussions, the debates on the question of Pakistan, which happened between 40 and 47. And these involve things like what comes to be known as the hostage population theory, that the security of minority populations on both sides would be guaranteed by a certain balance of terror, that in case one set of people here are persecuted by the majority, retributive violence can be visited upon the minority on the other side. And you do see this fairly, this is fairly wide, this kind of rhetoric is fairly widespread when the demand, when the whole question of Pakistan is being talked about. The other thing also that needs to be remembered here is that transfers of population. The question of transfers of population is talked about quite frequently, and Mr. Jinnah in his very first press conference after the Lahore resolution makes it clear that transfers of population to a certain extent have to be considered. Here, you have, in a way, you kind of look at populations as if they are objects which can be transported hither and thither, as if, they have no ties to the places where they live. And, you have somebody like Ambedkar too, talking about transfers of population and saying that's the best way to resolve the communal problem in India. So given the tropes, that are being used and the ways in which partition is being discussed along these lines, I think you can understand, you can have a much better understanding of the violence which happens in 46, 47 by taking into account these kinds of fairly incendiary and passionate discussions in the public sphere.
I think what I'd like to say is that the impression that you're getting here from the discussion on the panel is that organized violence, organized by whom? By the Muslim League and the Congress, by the RSS, by the Muslim League National Guard. I think it's extremely important not to have too broad a brush stroke on what really requires careful micro-analysis of the violence. When you do micro-analysis of the violence, you don't get a single pattern emerging. For the Punjab, you find demobilized soldiers from the Second World War playing a very major role in the violence, in the organized kind of violence. And one of the points I argued in my book, Self and Sovereignty, is precisely that it was the acquisition of arms in certain localities by banded individuals that really tipped the scales and led to violence, especially in those areas where minority populations had property. And so I think it's really important to understand what the violence was about. It was not about religion, as we've always assumed and continue to. It was about the acquisition of property from minorities that ended up being on the wrong side. So let's get that clear. And so let's also understand what organized violence really means. Genocide of the kind that we have been witnessing in more recent times is truly organized with some state support. But was this state organized violence? So I think that's very important to really bring in.
The question of the state
and I think we want to hear Urvashi.
May I come in here? I think that it's, as Ayesha says, it's not one or the other. It's not that the violence was only organized. It's not that there was an absence of what you might define as madness. And it's not as if there wasn't a base in people's lives for what then transformed into the madness that people described, people who lived through that time. Let me give you an example. For example, had families not been inherently violent towards their women, you would not have seen the kind of violence that partition showed towards women, not only in terms of rape, but in terms of the way families killed their own women. Because that gave them a basis, that patriarchal understanding, that excusing of violence. Also, the whole question of minorities. I think we make a mistake when we think of minorities only in terms of Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs. Hindus the majority, Muslims the minority, Sikhs in some way the minority that's balancing out power between the Muslims and Hindus. We need to think of all the other communities who are not defined by religion. Dalits were a minority in the Punjab. Dalits made a demand for a homeland. Until we understand that, we are not going to understand how partition dealt with minorities. You could look at women as a kind of technical minority, if you like, then you need to understand their experience. What about the Parsis? What about the Hijras? What about the people who were in mental hospitals? These were different kinds of people who were impacted by this. And had there not been a basis in land rights, as Ayesha says, owning of property, had there not been a basis in the deeply unequal relations between Hindus and Muslims in the Punjab, in the UP, in the East, we would not have seen the kind of violence. Once you organize it, then you can pull along a whole lot of people who might have other grouses which form part of that. So I think the understanding has to be more than either this or that.
So that's indicating that we really need to take into account territorial question and property question at the heart of
and the gender question
and the gender question at the heart
and the caste
of
question.
So there's inequalities that are really fundamental to interrogating the nature of the violence and not just to leave it to thinking about it as something that can be just reduced to religious identities. My next question is actually for Urvashi, and maybe you've already started answering it, which is that the other side of silence. You focused on the marginalized voices of women, Dalits, and children. And in your new book, The Long Shadow, you bring together marginalized regional histories, Ladakh, Kashmir, etc. And so to think about what is the kind of work that these marginalized histories, the margins do for thinking about the dominant histories that had circulated 2 decades ago when you first wrote The Other Side, and what are still in circulation today. If one might think about one dominant narrative that's persistent today, that maybe The Long Shadow is in conversation with, that is trying to think about and work against, if I may ask you.
Well, I think, you know, the thing about partition history is, or partition histories, because I guess we must always speak of them as multiple histories, is that there is still so much more that we have to understand about the ways in which history sort of took place at that time. And what strikes me is that even today, despite the wealth of academic scholarship, and you've got some of the best scholars sitting here on the table, but there's a whole lot more, despite that, our day-to-day discussions are absent. We hardly ever, why don't you see hundreds of television shows about partition? We don't see that much, a serial or two. So I think that that's one thing, and to me, as somebody who's interested in partition, not in an academic way, but in a kind of feminist way, the feminist prism opened up for me a lot of histories which otherwise I had not even thought that I would see, like the regional histories. So Ladakh, I mean, we have an essay in this book about Ladakh from a Muslim Ladakhi family which was charged for hundreds of years with carrying the offerings to the Dalai Lama from Ladakh to Tibet to present them, and the journey took 2 months, and along the way they married, intermarried, had families, and then as partition starts to come, the borders start to close and Ladakh gets reduced to a tiny little space inside Jammu and Kashmir. I had never thought of that kind of thing. So I think in some ways the issues we see around us, especially in India, looking at Ladakh, looking at Assam, looking at the way the Dalits were housed in Dandakarnya much later by the communist government of West Bengal, these are things we have not actually even considered. So they can add so much more to our understanding of that moment. And I think that moment has to be approached in its political histories. So all the discussions we're having about Congress, Muslim League, Jinnah, Nehru, etc., but also in terms of the histories from below, and those are constantly unfolding.
So my next question is for Venkat. Venkat, your very well received book, you argue that Pakistan was imagined by Muslims of UP right from the get-go as a sovereign Islamic state with pan-Islamic ambitions. And as some critics have argued now, your argument rests heavily on the exclusion of modernist thought amongst Muslims, including towering figures like Maulana Azad, as if you could read a direct line from the Hindu Mahasabha to the present, with the exclusion of many great figures, including Gandhi, in the making of, say, the idea of India. Now, given that religious parties have an uncertain status, a matter of religion remains so troubled and a matter of debate within Pakistan, given this kind of historical narrative that you present, in a way is quite controversial and has in many ways confirmed understandings of this history, particularly Muslim history, as irreconcilable within an Indian history, as partition not just inevitable but also necessary, And in one review of your book by Pranab Bhanumehta, suggesting that Hindus, that it showed that Hindus had their limits in their ability to live with difference. Now we know that narratives of partition are mobilized to make arguments not just about the past, but about the present. If I may ask you how you think about where the place of your argument is in relation to the politics of the present, and also in terms of the kinds of openings for thinking about histories of the future might be located.
Okay. To begin with, I do foreground number of debates within the Muslim community on the question of Pakistan. So what I try to say up front is that there is no unanimity within the Muslim community on the question of Pakistan, that some of the most trenchant critiques of Pakistan, of partition, emerge from within the Muslim community. And yes, Azad doesn't figure in my narrative, but that has to do with the fact that, well, there is, well, on the one hand, let's say Azad is almost a cliche, you know, there's so much written about him. The other thing is that I wanted to foreground the voices of others who have not thus far been considered. So for example, the people that I bring up, somebody like Sayyid Muhammad Sajjad Bihari from Bihar, or Hifzur Rahman Sehharvi, or Hussain Ahmad Madani, or Tufail Ahmad Manglori. Yeah? So I am bringing to fore a whole lot of these people who are really at the forefront as far as debating the question of Pakistan is concerned. And you should remember at this point in time that after 42, Azad, along with the rest of the Congress leadership, is in prison. And he, in a way, ceases to be really a factor when it comes to popular mobilization of any kind. Of course, he is put up by the Congress as part of their negotiating team when discussions over the transfer of power are happening, which of course becomes a sore point with the Muslim League and the others. But you know, to say that to say that I have not brought out some of these people, I think would be not quite true. So what I'm trying to say is that what I have done in this book is to kind of present a series of debates on the question of Pakistan within the Muslim community, and almost every chapter is kind of set up in terms of a debate. So to say that I'm drawing a kind of a direct teleological line, I think would be not quite accurate.
Yes, I'd just like to add that Venkat's work is also, I mean, some people have done work earlier than him on a similar sort of, I mean, I of course argue the Jinnah kept it vague, allowing the people to make of it what they wished. My work was about high politics. Shamanti Ghosh for Bengal, more recently Nilesh Bose for Bengal, I myself for Punjab, in terms of the multiplicity of debates. But the challenge really for a historian is to be able to show how these debates transferred into the post-independence period. To what extent were these debates in the UP actually being informing the debates that occurred in Pakistan, or for that matter in India later about Pakistan. So I do think that that remains a challenge for us, because many of the issues that were debated in the immediate aftermath of partition emerged from the dislocations and the shock of partition as well. So they were morphed. But I take your point. You join a group of younger scholars who are doing more of this, and I think it's interesting, but it is actually, while creating the depth of the discussions at the regional level, we still need to understand how these influence the politics of the Muslim League in the post-independence period.
I'm going to turn the last question to Yasmin. We were having a conversation earlier about the narratives of partition, and there has been an explosion of narratives that have been emerging about partition, drawn sometimes from memory, personalized accounts being pulled together to create narrative forms. Is there a limit to the narrative form? Do we need other kinds of historical inquiries? Do we need to be asking other kinds of questions in order to really grapple with the complexity of this event, such that we're not left between choosing one narrative over another, but really encouraged to ask complex questions instead?
I think this gets back to that idea of multiplicities of stories, of multiple histories of partition, which Urvashi was referring to. And of course, at some level, we need narratives. The narrative I wrote of partition is used on the history curriculum for A-level in some schools in the UK, and you have students who don't know anything about the bare blocks of partition, and they want to know, and then they can read out from that and read in other ways and start to learn about the depth of research that there is there about partition. So we need different narratives. We need narratives like Nisid that people can pick up and read and piece together the stories. But I think beyond that, I think there is a risk of replaying the same tropes again and again and talking in collectivities, which really risks, constantly essentializing and boiling this down to the trains and the epic movement of people and the refugees, and we lose something in that collective story. And sometimes it's the individual stories that make the difference. And I was struck in Ayesha's book about Manto, about how just one life story and one biography can actually give insights which transcend that point of 1947. They can transcend that temporal moment and actually give us a different entry point. And I think we've long known that novels, films, other kinds of medium are doing that in a way that narrative, it can kind of, it reaches a limit. It reaches a point that it can't quite give us that human insight, that we need to be truly empathetic towards the people who suffered at that time. And I think we're constantly finding that, and that also means ranging across geography and looking at other regions outside Punjab, which has had the lion's share of attention, and really making this a subcontinental story. So it's the kind of that breadth, that huge scale, but also the micro, the detail, and the individual human who stands at the heart of partition.
May I add to that? Just add my voice to yours. And I think that there is I don't know if there are limits to narrative, but I think we can't look at narrative as the only prism through which we can look at these histories, because what it provides, or what narratives provide, is what the more straightforward political histories don't necessarily provide. And narratives don't necessarily have to be collective, but there is the individual story. But what is happening today, I think, is really interesting. The new kinds of sources that are being looked at. Art is one thing, and there are a lot of collective art projects that cross the borders between Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and the diaspora. And I think we have to talk about Bangladesh, because there is that history that we tend to completely ignore. All of us sitting up here have worked on the West, so that's the other thing. I think there is things like different kinds of memory work that people are doing, and different kinds of archives that are being created. You're aware of the Citizens Archive of Pakistan, which has done fantastic work, the 1947 Partition Archive. There is quite a lively discussion going on now about whether or not the moment is right to set up a partition museum. And if that museum is set up, what can it contain? And can it be on both sides? And can it be located at the border? And all of those things. And films, of course, and literature. So there is the literature of that time that grew out of the work of writers who were witness to that moment, which has a different immediacy, and the literature of now, which is the second or third generation down, using, for example, the graphic story to try and make sense of what happened. Graphic stories written across borders. There's this lovely volume called This Side, That Side, which is created by artists from Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India, together writing divided histories. Work in schools, teachers are meeting and talking. So I think all of those ways are ways that help us to understand this history.
Just a very quick comment. Recently, only yesterday, I saw a Gallup poll from Pakistan suggesting that 39% of Pakistanis say that they were helped during partition by a Hindu or a Sikh. what about those narratives?
Yeah,
I think we
exactly.
need to bring those narratives in
Yes.
as well. Because really the scale of violence, while absolutely unacceptable, would have been unconscionable if more people didn't help each other. And I don't think those narratives have yet been told.
And actually, that's where minorities in Pakistan also played a major role.
right.
The work of Christians in Kashmir, also the minorities in the Baramulla killings and so on. In your own work, Muslim families who stayed behind, all of these things are things we need to look at actually.
No, it's just the idea that any one book could encompass all the various aspects of partition is impossible. I mean, it's very easy for any reviewer, to say, oh, you left out this or you left out that. Of course, unless you want a 5,000-page book, you're going to have to leave out many, many different things. But that's why it's important to have these multiple narratives. And there are certain kinds of narratives, I think, that can answer questions better than others. So literature and art can approach some of these more difficult questions in a way that a straight political narrative, straight history could never possibly hope to do. So it's all very important together.
Thank you. I'd like to open up to questions from the audience. I am not sure if, there's mics going around. So there's one hand up here. There's a person at the back after you. Yeah.
We have discussed partition again and again, and we have failed to discuss the basic nature of Hindus and Muslims. A Hindu never believes in equality. Islam was never a religion of peace. Out of first 4 caliphs, 3 were murdered. One was murdered when he was offering nawaz. And Hindus distort the facts very easily. I will give you a very simple example of yesterday. There was a discussion on Ramcharitmanas. Thomas, a Harvard University professor, has translated Ramcharitmanas in English. Now the Saryu Pari Brahmins, mainly led by Vajpayee, boycotted Tulsi Das during his last stage. Abdul Rahim Khan Khana, the son of Behram Khan, arranged his living in this Babri mosque. Last 20 years, Tulsi Das lived in a mosque. He begged, upper caste refused to give him alms. It was the OBCs, he never took alms from scheduled caste. It were the OBCs which were given alms. One thing. Second thing, you have discussed the partition issue. You have never discussed where the violence started first. Violence started first in Rawalpindi. At that time there was no Islamabad. And it was started by Muslims. Sikandar Hayat Khan, the Prime Minister of Punjab, Pakistan, declared if there is partition, Muslims will kill all Hindus.
Okay.
Stop that.
Stop.
You always include
Thank you.
Where is the question?
There is no question. Stop. Please stop.
You should take
I think that deserves some response.
I'll answer that last point very quickly. I think that's something you hear often, that the violence in August was started in March and the Rawalpindi riots. You may easily make the case that the violence started before in the Bihar riots, or it started before in the Calcutta riots. And it's, how far back do you have to go? And there's no one moment where one side lit a flame and launched this rolling wave of violence. Both sides were complicit in it, both leaders, both political parties, and people all the way down to the grassroots level.
There's a question there, the man in blue scarf. That's you.
Hello. What was the role of politicians in promoting violence and trying to put a stop to violence?
Who's going to take that? Role of politicians in promoting or stopping.
The role of politicians
What was the role of politicians in stopping?
in the
Why don't you
violence.
take that? Since you
Sorry. What was the role of politicians in promoting violence and in trying to put a stop to violence?
Complicated.
Well, you do have. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, there was demagoguery on every side. There was demagoguery for sure, and as tensions escalated, people were using intemperate, inflammatory language. That is certain. did that mean that the top level leaders of the main parties anticipated the kind of violence that was about to unfold? No. I think everything shows that the top level leaders of the League and the Congress and other parties were absolutely shocked and dismayed at what unfolded, and tried very quickly to scramble to try and prevent what threatened the origins of the states that were coming into existence. So I think preceding partition, certainly, politicians have a lot of blood on their hands because they did use demagogic language.
But I think one also needs to remember Gandhi for, for the enormous amount of work that he did to try and stop the violence everywhere. So I do think we need to remember.
And I think it's important to remember it's also a moment of transition. The colonial state is withdrawing, troops have been decommissioned, police forces are in disarray. Yeah. I think, Nisid, your book accounts for that very well, district by district, where police officers are being, the administrative structure of the colonial state is being pulled apart. And so the state is at its weakest to respond to what unfolds as well, and I think that's an important part of the story.
Right. The army is totally communalized, and I just want to add to what Venkat said, remembering the role of Gandhi and Bacha Khan, because he went to Noakhali with Gandhi, and I think that was really important to note that there were many people who tried to stop it also.
There's the question of, sorry.
Okay, some young hands up there. Can you give these, there's this young man here. Yeah.
There are some hands here also, Vazira.
Hi. Yeah.
Yep.
Miss Butalia and Dr. Jalal alluded to this point of how the West has been privileged in our histories of partition and the literature on partition. So could you just provide reasons as to why this is the case? Is it just because even in popular imagination, when we look at partition, we look at the Punjab? Is it because there was a lesser degree of violence at the time of partition in Bengal? And also, what were the factors for that? Was it just Gandhi's presence along with Shahid Suravardi in Calcutta, the miracle of Calcutta? Or is that just a perception that there was a lesser degree of violence? If you could just dwell on that a little bit. Thank you.
Of course, the first instance of mass violence, sadly, was in Calcutta at the time of the Calcutta killings. But yes, I do think that the violence in Bengal was staggered over a period of time. The violence in Punjab was really beginning with the Rawalpindi killings. I mean, it just sort of morphed into mass violence after the June 3rd plan was announced. So I think that's the reason why we talk about the Punjab violence, because at the time of 47, it was Punjab that was most shaken by the dislocations of partition and the mass violence that preceded, please.
Yeah, and my point really is that Ayesha is absolutely right. It was spread over a much longer period of time, and Bengal had seen another previous partition as well. But I'm not only referring to West and East, but I think it's important to look at all the other stories of partition also that don't get spoken about so much. So, we can pride ourselves, somebody like me, I can say, okay, I'm looking at people's stories. But if I'm only looking at people's stories in Punjab, that's only part of the story. There is a whole Sindhi narrative of partition, there's a whole second generation narrative of partition. We need to look at how in the West, like the city like Bombay, what was the histories of Bombay, how were they linked with Sindh, and what happened. So all of these things are absent from our analysis. So I'm just pointing to those.
Okay. So question from this side, and okay, you'll be the next. And if you can keep it to a question and short.
It'll be very short. Urvashi, you like me are a second generation partition person. And one of the personal issues that comes up is the extreme amount of reluctance among those who survived partition to talk about it. I'm hearing stories now for the first time after 60 years, horrific stories, which I've never heard before. What, in your view, since you've looked at people's stories, lay behind this reluctance to talk about them?
See, I think it's very difficult to say. There's not one explanation, but I think partly what everyone on the panel has been saying, which is that this was a history that was very complex, in which Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs were all complicit in the violence and in lending their silence to not talking about the violence. That's one thing. I think historians have been reluctant to explore it because it's too close to the bone. I think also in the histories of nation states like ours, there comes a moment when it becomes both possible and necessary to talk about these histories, when people who have lived through those histories are themselves willing to talk about it. And it could be because they are nearing the end of their lives, it could be because they see polarization of relations around them. But I think those moments have started in our countries, let's say 15, 20 years ago, and it's a long moment that's continuing now, and as it unfolds, we see more and more coming out. Also, many of those people are now dying, and they've been wanting to speak somehow. So I think it's all of those things. It's not one single explanation, really.
Okay, short, please. Yeah.
I think one important dimension that this panel has missed is how the manner in which partition was done by Red Cliff just in 5 weeks' time. 7,000 kilometers was divided. And what were its repercussions and implications? Number two, I think there is urge between population of both the countries to live in peace and have people-to-people contact. But the manner in which we organize every evening a parade at Wagah, does it add to bringing people together, or should it be abandoned or displaced? And this question is from former border security chief of India, which was guarding the 7,000 kilometers. I think it should not be there, but now I want your answer.
On the question of the border, this comes up quite a bit, obviously, that the British sent a lawyer over who had never been to India before, gave him 5 weeks to divide the Punjab in half. I don't see, well, two things. First, where the border ended up was almost exactly where everyone knew it was going to end up. They had done a draft map a full year before, and aside of a few tweaks here and there, where the line ended up was very, very similar. So it shouldn't have been a huge surprise. And secondly, I don't see any way that the border could have been drawn to prevent the violence. The only way to have done that would have been to somehow keep the entire Sikh community together within one country, obviously India at that time, which would have left just a sliver of the Punjab to Pakistan and to Jinnah, which was never going to fly. The problem was nobody told the Sikh leaders this and made it clear to them, Nehru, Jinnah, nobody actually said, this is what's going to happen. We have to actually figure out whether it's transfers of population or property. We need to figure out how to handle it. I'll let somebody else answer the Wagah question.
Well, I do want to add that you can't. I mean, I think Vazira did bring the issue of the role of the departing colonial masters. They were unwilling to get involved with what they saw was India's perennial communal madness. They didn't want to get their hands dirtied. I mean, the story of the Punjab Boundary Commission is a case in point. It was disbanded before it could even complete its duties. And I think Vazira's own book tells us much more about this abandonment, the scuttle that occurred in 1947, and which Mountbatten describes as the greatest administrative activity that ever occurred. I mean, I think that's what we are questioning, that role was very important. I don't think the leaders, while very responsible in terms of their rhetoric, their demagoguery, they were not in power. The violence occurred whilst the transition, the greatest violence occurred during the period of June 3rd and August 14th, 15th. And I think you can add a bit.
And
rather
if
than
I may add, actually, I think also understanding partition being discussed, it has to be placed in the context of a longer history of the 20th century. What had been happening in Europe in the preceding several decades. I know Yasmin might be talking a little bit about the Second World War, but prior to the Second World War, I mean, these ideas of minority rights being inadequate, new nation states being formed, drawing new boundaries on the map, the kinds of violence and mass expulsions of people that were happening in Europe are in fact, I think, a very important background to what's happening in the Indian subcontinent too. Why were political leaders thinking in those terms? There was no way of drawing a line on the ground that would in fact protect people or respond to the ways in which lived lives were enmeshed. So just the very political concepts that were at work in forming partition, I think, really need to be placed in this horrific landscape of the 20th century. And I'd say even to this day, it becomes really pressing to think about it, because every so often you will pick up the New York Times, and partition as a solution is being offered up to Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, etc., as if, you know, the success story of the Indian subcontinent can now be parceled out to other places. So I think really grappling with partition itself as a kind of policy tool that one can pull out of the bag and implement on a landscape of people's lives is something that's at question, I think, in a lot of the historical queries that we have. So I want to go right back to this man with the yellow and black striped hand.
Yellow and black stripe.
Morning, everyone. You people just discussed about Partition Museum being discussed. Could you shed some more light on what is being discussed and what are the factors which are keeping the museum to come up from? Thank you.
Urvashi, I think that's for you.
Yeah, I think it's, at the moment, it's only a discussion in different places. For example, in Bangladesh, there's a group of people who've got together, architects, artists, and others who are dreaming about the possibility of setting up a partition museum, and they have a design and they worked out how it should be done, but they're now looking for money. In India, there is somebody who is thinking of that as well, and I think they're looking for land in Amritsar, and the Punjab government seems to have promised them something. In Pakistan, I think there's quite a lot of discussion on this among artists. I think it would be a great idea. My idea of Partition Museum would be, let's set it up at Wagah. Let it be interactive. Let people who come from one side talk to the others, let them talk to the others, and dispense with the ceremony. I think that would be a nice agenda.
That's a good response to the Wagah question. Yes.
Can't hear a word.
Can't hear you.
Hello. A response from Urvashi ji, Yasmin ji, and Ayesha ji to the small, detailed action plan in 1948.
I can't hear you. We can't hear you.
A small detail, your response to it, about the action plan to rescue, restore abducted women after the partition, immediately after that. I want your response and Yasmin ji's from your perspective, Ayesha ji.
Abducted women, the plan to
What's your
rescue abducted
response?
women. What's our responses to that? Yours.
You and you. I think it's the two of you.
I don't know what you mean by response, but I think people are familiar with this history of the thousands of women who were raped and abducted on both sides of the border, and the fact that the two governments came together very early on in December of 1947 to draft an agreement to go into each other's countries, into certain territories, not all of them, with the police, with social workers who were women, to, within quotes, rescue women who had been abducted and bring them back to what they called their home, which was defined in religious terms. So for Hindus, India; for Muslims, Pakistan. And it was a very, very interesting thing, which is quite complicated, because the state was acting on the reports that families had put into police stations. So you can ask, could the state have remained indifferent to these mass reports of the loss of women, the disappearance of women? But the state's actions were quite violative of the rights of women, and they also defined women in purely religious terms, whereas the women themselves might have seen themselves separately. Briefly, that's what happened. There's a lot of complicated histories there, not enough time to go into those.
Maybe I can just take 3 questions and then we have a response. Okay, just.
There are people at the back shouting.
You hear me? Hello? Yeah. My name is Rubina, and having lived both in India and Pakistan and been very negatively impacted by partition, I've always been fascinated by the question of where, in fact, I've believed it myself, about which of the leaders were more to blame for partition and the idea of Pakistan and how it came about it. And I believe that, having read quite a bit, that perhaps there's some undue, a disproportionate emphasis on Jinnah being being very much the person who brought it up. However, having read only just a few years ago Abul Kalam Azad's book, where the 100 pages were not allowed to be published till a certain time, that he was somebody who was very close to Nehru. He really knew the inside out. And one of the people who he places fairly and squarely the blame to share power between Jinnah and Nehru, between in the legislative assemblies, is Nehru himself. So I really would like to hear from just about everyone in the panel. I really would appreciate just like some answers.
I'm going to take 2 more questions, and then we can have a wind-up answer from everyone. There's a young man right at the back there who's been raising his hands. Any one of those 3 want to ask a question? And then there's a young hand up here.
हिंदी में बोल सकता हूँ एक सवाल?
हाँ बिल्कुल.
सवाल ये है कि क्या ज़्यादा ज़रूरी है कि कंट्रीज अपना ईगो सेटिस्फाई करें ये बोल के कि कश्मीर हमारा है या हमारा है, या फिर पार्टीशन के टाइम पे 20 लाख लोग मर गए. जब अमेरिका में सिविल वॉर हुआ कोई डिवीजन नहीं, कोई पार्टीशन नहीं हुआ अमेरिका में, लेकिन 12 लाख लोग मरे. यहाँ पार्टीशन हुआ तो 20 लाख लोग मरे. तो क्या ज़रूरी है कश्मीर हमारा रहे या उनका रहे, या लोगों की जानें ज़्यादा ज़रूरी हैं? तो व्हाट डू यू थिंक कि आपका व्यू क्या है इस चीज़ पे?
Yeah. Man with the purple sweater.
Or to pay attention to people's lives.
Hi. So sort of related question. During casual moments, generalized statement is made that between Gandhi and Jinnah, one died too early and one died too late for the sake of peace lovers. Is there any element of truth to that statement? Thank you.
The lady next to him.
My question is, did Gandhi have the power to stop the partition, and if yes, why did he not?
Do you want to take some responses? We have 5 minutes.
I'll take the last one. I mean, I don't think Gandhi had the political power to stop partition at that point. I mean, he had power to tamp down passions in different parts of the country, which he tried to do. But as Nehru said, this was treating symptoms, not the disease. The political forces pushing these 2 sides towards this particular solution were far too great, had gone far too far at that point for any individual to have stopped it. I don't think he can be blamed for it. And that actually loops back to the first question about whether Nehru is as much to blame as Jinnah. I would hesitate to assign a percentage to anyone, but I think it's clearly true. I think we'd all agree that the Congress led by Nehru made several mistakes in the run-up to partition, and there were moments at which greater political generosity, greater ability to compromise may have led to at least a temporary political solution. Whether that solution would have lasted, whether if you had maintained some sort of loose federation that you wouldn't have had greater violence 5-10 years down the line, nobody knows, right? But in terms of whether this particular form of partition could have been avoided if there had been different political decisions made in the months leading up to it, I think that's probably true.